When we look at European imperialism in the Pacific, it really begins with Captain Cook. And Captain Cook is going to explore the Pacific Islands and kind of help chart out that territory for Britain. He also reaches Australia. And when he reaches Australia, he sends word back that basically Australia was suitable for European settlement. Meanwhile, back in Britain, they were already kind of fearful of the overpopulation of their prisons. And so initially, Australia becomes a penal colony for Britain, and they ship prisoners to Australia. And that's how Australia was initially settled by the British. Then, when gold is discovered in Australia, that's going to lead to a new surge of European migration in the mid 1800s or so. Meanwhile, in New Zealand, the fertile soil of New Zealand attracted European settlers, and the Europeans arrive, and the native people, the Maori people, are initially decimated by European diseases. And as their population declined, well, this opened the door for more European settlement. And the British take over, and they take the best farmlands from the natives. They push the Maori onto marginalized land. And for a period of time, it looked like the natives, the Maori people, would be completely wiped out and their culture completely replaced by European culture. But they're able to rebound, and they learn to use European institutions to their advantage and help kind of preserve their own native culture. In the Pacific, Spain already controlled territories like the Philippines, and they're going to continue to ship silver from the Americas to the Philippines until the early 1800s. And then that silver goes from the Philippines to China for luxury goods. Meanwhile, the rest of the Pacific, the United States has begun to kind of map out some of the Pacific islands, and they're going to explore the Pacific coast and explore Hawaii and sends missionaries to Hawaii. And then the United States arrives in Japan. And when the United States arrives in Japan, Japan was still in that self-imposed isolation. And the United States forces them to open up to trade. And so by the end of this era, pretty much all of the Pacific is under European and Western control. The United States is going to acquire Alaska and Hawaii and the Philippines and Guam. Germany is going to buy a lot of the Spanish Pacific Islands, and France, Britain, and Germany basically controlled most of the rest of the Pacific. And they're going to create plantations on many of these islands and produce things like sugar and copra, which copra is a dried coconut that was used in vegetable oil, and guano, which was used for fertilizers. When we look at the United States and their role in imperialism, first off, they don't get involved in imperialism until later. And part of that was because they were more concerned with their own westward expansion. And so the idea of manifest destiny, that they were destined to control all of the territory to the Pacific Ocean. And so they're going to push west during this period. And railroads are going to greatly aid that. And as they continue to push west, it's going to drive the Native Americans onto reservations. And they're going to purchase the Louisiana Territory from France. This is during the French Revolution. Napoleon sold it because he needed money for his campaigns back in Europe, and continued to push westward. So that was their main goal, was to continue the settlement all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Once that was complete, they do begin to play a small role in imperialism. And so one of the biggest regions that the United States played a role in was Latin America. And they're going to pass the Monroe Doctrine, which basically told Europe to stay out of the Western Hemisphere. They didn't want Europe coming in and carving up Latin America the same way they were doing to Africa and Asia. But the Monroe Doctrine also justified the U.S. interventions in Latin America. And so the United States is going to continue to play a big role in Latin American affairs throughout this entire era and into the next era as well. The US is also going to gain new territory after the Mexican-American War. The Mexican-American War was sparked when the United States annexes Texas. And this upsets Mexico because they felt Texas was still their territory, and it's going to lead to the outbreak of war. The United States defeats Mexico, and as a result, they gain a large amount of Mexico's territory in the modern-day southwestern United States, the territory of New Mexico and Arizona and California. The US is also going to gain some overseas territories. They're going to acquire some Pacific islands. They're going to purchase Alaska from Russia. Hawaii would be annexed as well. And then the Spanish-American War is going to give the US some other territory around the globe. Spanish-American War was a short conflict. It only lasted about 3 months between the United States and Spain. It was a conflict that erupts in Cuba, which was still under Spanish rule. And ultimately, the United States defeats Spain. And as a result, the United States gains control of Spanish territory in Puerto Rico, in Guam, and the Philippines. And Cuba basically becomes a U.S. protectorate. The United States is also going to intervene in the building of the Panama Canal. The U.S. wanted to build the canal to make it much easier to get ships from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean, and without having to go all the way around South America. And this was important not just for trade, but now that the U.S. was gaining territory in different parts of the globe, they needed to be able to move their navy as well. And so the territory where they wanted to build the canal was originally under Colombian control. And they go to Colombia to purchase the rights to build the canal, and Colombia basically tells them no. Technically, Colombia was hoping to hold out for more money, but it all kind of backfires because in the United States, helped a group of rebels in Panama establish independence, and then the new state of Panama would grant the United States the right to build their canal. When we look at Japanese imperialism, so at the beginning of this era, Japan was still in that self-imposed isolation. And the United States, under Commodore Matthew Perry, shows up on their coast and orders them to open up to trade. And in a very short amount of time, Japan is going to catch up on everything they missed out on during that self-imposed isolation. And so this is known as the Meiji Restoration. And the Meiji Restoration, technically it was a restoring of power back to the emperor. And so this is one of the few periods in all of Japan's history where the emperor actually had power. And under the Meiji Restoration, they're going to industrialize and modernize in a very short amount of time. Basically, in a single generation, they're able to catch up on all the stuff they missed out on under the previous 150 years or so of isolation. And so they're going to update their military. They're going to update their bureaucracy. They're going to update their navy. And then they use that to basically become the dominant power in East Asia. And it's going to be shown in two key victories that they win at the end of this era. The Sino-Japanese War was a war between Japan and China. And when rebellions break out in Korea, China sends in their army to restore order. And in response to this, Korea was kind of at this time, a kind of tribute relationship with Japan. Japan sends in their army and declares war on China. And as a result, Japan pretty easily defeats China. And they force China to sign these unequal treaties that basically give Japan trade rights in China. And they force Korea to basically become now a Japanese tribute state. The Russo-Japanese War was a war between Russia and Japan. And it was a conflict over territory between Japan and Russia. And in the Russo-Japanese War, Japan's navy completely wipes out Russia's navy. In fact, this loss is going to spark a revolution in Russia, the 1905 revolution. But what it proved was that Japan was now the dominant power in East Asia.